Was traveling solo around the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, making various stops in the Olympic National Park. I decided to stop in Connaught for the first time and took a dead-end road that ended at a beautiful spot at the edge of the Connaught River. There was an ancient footbridge that led across the river, but it looked like it might collapse if I tried to cross it, so I decided not to. It was off-season and I was not in the tourist area. I was the only one there. It was so unusually hot outside that I decided that I needed to get in that water. I backed my car all the way to the edge of the dead-end road, faced it out in the direction I would need to leave, and started hiking through thick brush down an embankment to the edge of the water. It was mid-fall and I didn't have a suit since I didn't plan on swimming, so I just took my clothes off and got in the water in my bra and underwear. I had a nice swim, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was in the middle of nowhere. After about 5 minutes, the creepy feeling was enough for me to want to head back, so I started to climb out and turn my back to the other side of the river and walk towards my clothes and shoes that I left behind. When I turned around, there was a big, tall man standing in plain view, just across from me on the other side of the river, but higher up on his embankment than I was on mine. He was wearing a poncho made of animal pelts and had long hair full of sticks and twigs, and looked like he had been living out in the wild for a very long time. We stood and stared at each other for what felt like forever, when all of a sudden he frantically took off in the direction of the footbridge leading across the water. I grabbed my car key, tried to grab my clothes and shoes, but they got tangled up in some blackberry vines, so I left everything and went running for my life through the thick brush and blackberries, barefoot in my underwear trying to make it to my car before he made it across the river. There's no doubt in my mind that he was trying to harm me. When I made it out of the blackberries, I could see he was crossing the bridge towards me very rapidly. I got to my car and flung my door open just as he arrived. I locked the doors while he pounded on the hood of my car, just screaming and grunting non-verbally. The moment he went from my driver's side door, I hit the gas and took off as fast as I could. I looked back and he was chasing after me. He must have ran after my car for at least a mile until he faded from view. I was bleeding everywhere from running nearly naked through blackberries. I was wet, unclothed, shaking and crying. Had I hesitated for literally 10 seconds longer, I don't think I would have made it out alive. Even typing this story out again all these years later, I'm starting to shake. I feel like I was being hunted. This is the only way I can describe it. I will never ever go back to that area. Since that moment, I always bring a hiking buddy with me when I venture out into the forest. That day is going to haunt me for life. I've had many years of therapy, and that experience is still as vivid as the day it happened. This happened to me a few years ago. I used to go to school at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I'm a runner, and the campus is in beautiful redwood forest, so I would run on the trails. One day I left a little later than usual on a run through one of the more isolated trails. Here's where it gets weird. I was about 15 minutes running deep into the woods and still hadn't seen anyone else around. Suddenly, up ahead, I saw what appeared to be a homeless man in ragged clothing walking on the trail. Now, he was walking further into the woods, and this path went very, very far, and the sun was setting, aka this man was spending the night in the woods. I wanted to reach my usual running checkpoint before turning back, so I decided to keep my distance and run by him. As soon as I passed the man, he called out to me. What came first, light or sound? In my head, I was like, what the fuck, this guy's nuts. But I decided to humor him and yelled out light without looking back. He said, well, I think it's sound, but who knows? And started mumbling to himself, so I continued on. I reached my goal and started to head back. It was really dark now, and I was feeling sketched out that I had to pass this guy again to get back. He seemed pretty crazy and potentially dangerous, but I didn't have a choice. I got past the point where I first passed him, but he was nowhere to be seen. There weren't any other branches of the trail, and if he had headed back, I would have seen him by then. He must have gone off the trail. Suddenly, a girl from up on the hill screamed for me to stop. I stopped and looked up on the hill, but it was too dark to see anything. I freaked out. I called out to ask if she was alright, and eventually he saw her climbing down. The hill was really steep, so she put in a lot of effort to get up there and away from whatever was after her. She said that she was on a run when a scary homeless guy started harassing her, and he chased her up the hill. But she didn't know where he went. She was going to spend the night there until I came along because she was too scared to go back down. At this point, we both wanted to get the hell out of there. Who knew if this crazy man was like lurking around watching us from the dark? So we ran back together and made it to the road. She thanked me and we parted ways. And I never ran back on that trail again. Santa Cruz can be a pretty weird place. I've heard legends of students flunking out of school there and then just living in the forest. Maybe this guy was a student from years past. When I was very little, like 5 or 6, my dad used to take me on all sorts of adventures through nature, especially when we owned a little cottage up in the Scottish Highlands. Now my dad is sort of a combo, Irish bloke and a Yorkshire lady type of a fellow. And on this particular occasion, he had decided we were going to go hiking way up in the cliffs. I was quite happy with this development as it meant a piggyback ride for at least 90% of the difficult bits. This was a proper trek. He wanted to get to one of the highest bluffs so we would have an amazing 360 view of the gorgeous meadows and some sparkling sea. But after we reached the top plains, where it's all short wind-whipped grass, you can see for miles, he suddenly turned very still and very quiet. When you're small, your parents are God, so seeing your dad look frightened is scarier than anything your own mind can come up with. So I was pulling on his arm and going, "What? What's wrong?" My mom is epileptic, and I saw her fits when I was a kid, so I thought it was happening to him too, or something similar. And I wouldn't know what to do because we're up on this huge cliff and no one is around. When just as fast as he started it, he snapped out of it. Fireman lifted me right up and started striding away without a word. Over his shoulder I could see a big pale yellow object stuck in the ground like an obelisk. I now know that it was a refrigerator. When I was older and I asked my dad about it, he stiffened up and told me that when he was a boy in the 50s, he and his friends had found an old style fridge in the woods, and being little boys, they opened it. Well, of course they had found a body, another child who by whichever means had found themselves in the fridge and unable to get out. My dad had never mentioned a gender, which leads me to believe he either witnessed a very decomposed or skeletonized individual. But I can't ask him. Remember that episode of The Simpsons where they unlock Homer's PTSD, and it turns out he found a dead body when he was a teenager? My dad grew increasingly uncomfortable the first time we saw that episode, and had excused himself to the kitchen before the ending. My dad has seen some gnarly shit, but for whatever reason he will not discuss anything further about this dead child in the fridge, only that it happened. So when he explained, I assumed it was the trauma and I said something like, "Oh Dad, that's awful. So when you see the fridge up there, it brings up old memories?" And he honestly looked at me with his big blue eyes like I was an idiot. I'll never forget it. "No, Amy," he said in a very low tone. "It was because it was the same fridge."